The days leading up to the concert blurred together in a haze of rehearsals, interviews, and restless nights. Michael had always lived under pressure, but this time it felt different. The city buzzed with anticipation. Tickets had sold out in minutes, and fans camped outside his hotel chanting his name for hours. Behind the cheers, though, there was an undercurrent of unease that Michael couldn't shake. Anonymous letters had been delivered to the hotel, scrawled in jagged handwriting, full of threats and cryptic warnings. Bill, his head of security, kept them locked in a folder, showing only a few to Michael, but even the fragments unsettled him. One phrase echoed in his head: "When the lights rise, the silence will fall." He didn't know if it was empty bravado or something more sinister, but he couldn't ignore it. The hotel room felt like a cage. Curtains drawn, lights dim, television flickering soundlessly in the background. Michael paced the carpet until the fibers flattened beneath his feet. His voice coach urged him to rest, his doctors begged him to eat, but his stomach turned at the thought of food. At night he would stare at the ceiling, listening to the muffled roar of fans outside, caught between gratitude and dread. He knew he couldn't disappoint them, but what if the threats were real? What if this time the stage didn't save him? During rehearsals, the crew noticed the difference. His spins were a fraction slower, his voice sometimes cracked, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Still, when the music started, something inside him clicked. His body remembered what his mind wanted to forget. The rhythms flowed through him, muscle memory carrying him across the stage, reminding everyone why he was the greatest performer alive. But the moment the music stopped, the mask slipped. He would retreat to a corner, towel over his head, breathing heavily as if chased by unseen demons. One afternoon, while the dancers practiced formations, Michael slipped away to the empty seats of the arena. The rows stretched endlessly, shadows swallowing the farthest corners. He sat alone, imagining the thousands of faces that would soon fill the space, the deafening screams, the blinding lights. A sudden chill crawled over him. He pictured the crowd in chaos, someone rushing the stage, a voice shouting from the darkness. He closed his eyes tightly, whispering to himself, "They came for love, not hate. They came for love." Back at the hotel, Bill pressed him to increase security. More guards at the barricades, stricter bag checks, plainclothes officers in the crowd. Michael nodded absently, but inside he hated it. He had always wanted fans to feel close to him, to feel safe in his presence. He remembered being a child, clutching his mother's hand at the carnival, overwhelmed by joy when the performer on stage smiled directly at him. That moment had sparked his dream. Now he feared becoming the very opposite, a figure on stage surrounded by walls, unreachable, armored against the very people who gave him life. The night before the concert, Michael barely slept. He wandered his suite like a ghost, pausing at the window to watch fans camped below. Some were singing his songs, their voices rising into the night. Others held candles, their faces glowing in the dim light. He pressed his forehead against the glass, whispering, "I can't let them down." But his reflection stared back at him, gaunt and weary, and he wondered if he already had. Morning came heavy with dread. The hotel lobby was a storm of movement, security pacing, crew members clutching schedules, managers arguing into phones. Cameras flashed outside as journalists pressed against barriers, desperate for a glimpse. In his suite, though, there was silence. Michael sat at the edge of his bed, robe draped loosely around his shoulders, staring into the dark screen of the television. His breakfast cooled untouched on the table. He scribbled fragments of lyrics in a notebook, half-finished lines about fear and courage, trying to turn his anxiety into music. Bill entered with another letter, delivered only hours before. The same jagged handwriting, the same cryptic menace, "The silence will fall when the lights rise." Michael read it calmly, placed it on the table, and whispered, "They can't stop me." His voice was soft but firm, a promise to himself as much as to anyone else. Across the city, fans were already flooding the stadium. They wore glittering jackets, sequined gloves, t-shirts emblazoned with his face. Some held handmade signs, some wept openly, Some sang his songs in unison. News cameras captured the frenzy, anchors describing the electric anticipation. None of them knew about the letters, about the unease stalking every rehearsal and meeting. They only knew that tonight they would see their hero, their king. Inside the stadium, preparations were frantic. Lights blazed, sound systems thundered, stagehands taped positions on the floor. Security radios crackled with constant updates. Every bag was inspected, every ticket scanned with suspicion. Guards lined the barricades, eyes scanning every movement. Yet even with the heightened precautions, there was no way to inspect every corner, no way to silence every possibility. The production manager barked orders through a headset, his voice betraying nervous energy. Michael dressed slowly, each piece of the costume laid out like sacred armor. The sequined jacket shimmered under the lights, the crisp white shirt gleamed, the black slacks hung with precision. As his stylist buttoned the shirt and smoothed the fabric, he kept his eyes closed, breathing deeply, centering himself. His makeup artist applied foundation, eyeliner, powder, transforming him into the figure the world expected. When he finally rose, fully dressed, the transformation was startling. The fragile man from the hotel bed vanished. In his place stood Michael Jackson, king of pop, larger than life. The illusion was fragile, but in that moment, it was enough. The convoy of black SUVs cut through the streets in the afternoon. Fans lined the sidewalks, screaming, chasing the cars, pressing against barriers. Michael peered through the tinted window, pressing his palm against the glass. Their devotion was overwhelming, both lifting him and weighing him down. They saw a savior, not a man. As the convoy neared the stadium, the roar of the crowd became deafening. Police struggled to hold back the flood of fans. Inside the SUV, Michael's pulse quickened. This was his world, his responsibility, and tonight it felt like it could swallow him whole. Backstage was chaos. Dancers stretched, technicians scurried, managers barked orders over radios. The air smelled of sweat, hairspray, and electricity. Michael was ushered into his private room, away from the storm. He sat in the dim light, hands clasped, head bowed, the muffled roar of the audience vibrating through the walls. Bill entered with one last briefing. "We've checked everything. The stage is secure. The crowd's clean. But Michael, if you don't feel ready, we can delay." Michael lifted his head slowly, eyes sharp. "No. They came for me. They believe in me. I can't let them down." The countdown began. 30 minutes. 15. 10. The dancers huddled together, whispering encouragements. The band tuned their instruments, forced smiles hiding nerves. In the stands, the crowd rippled with energy, waves of sound crashing as fans chanted his name. Thousands of flashbulbs lit the dark like fireflies. Michael stood just behind the curtain, only feet from the stage. The lights dimmed, smoke billowed, the giant screens flickered to life. The roar was indescribable, a force of nature. His heart pounded like a drum, breath catching in his throat. He whispered to himself, "For them. For the music. For love." The stage manager leaned close, headset crackling. "Michael, it's time." Michael stepped forward, and the curtain began to rise. The roar that greeted him was a tidal wave, shaking the ground beneath his feet. He strode forward, every step deliberate, every gesture igniting hysteria. The band struck the first chords, and his body moved with flawless precision. Each spin, each glide drew deafening responses. For a while, he lost himself in the music, adrenaline drowning the doubts. But soon, unease crept back. Near the front rows, he spotted commotion. Guards swarmed a spot, their movements frantic. At first, he thought it was the usual fainting, but the panic didn't subside. Michael pivoted mid-dance, eyes scanning the disturbance. He saw a young woman collapse, arms limp, face pale. The crowd around her shoved and shouted. His voice faltered, microphone catching a breath. The band played on, the dancers executed their steps, but Michael couldn't ignore it. He slid to the edge of the stage, signaling furiously to security. The spotlight followed him, the crowd roaring louder, mistaking urgency for theatrics. He crouched, extending a trembling hand. Guards tried to wave him back, but he shook his head violently. "Bring her here," he mouthed. Against protocol, they lifted the unconscious girl over the barricade. The audience erupted, thousands craning to see. Michael cleared a space on stage, kneeling beside her. He pressed a hand to her forehead, whispering words no one else could hear. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the surreal moment to every corner of the arena. The girl stirred faintly, lips parting as if to breathe his name. The medic checked her pulse, nodding quickly. She was alive, overcome by exhaustion. Relief swept through the crew, but Michael wasn't done. He took the microphone, voice quivering but strong. "She's okay. She's going to be fine." The crowd erupted in cheers. Then he added, "This is why we are here. Not just for music, but for love. For each other." The band resumed, and Michael launched into an impromptu ballad, his voice raw, soaring. He sang directly to the girl, still recovering, and to the crowd who watched with tears streaming. The energy shifted completely, fear melting into unity. The rest of the show blazed with renewed passion, Michael pushing himself harder than ever, as if defying the shadows. By the finale, the stadium was a sea of light, fans holding phones, lighters, glowing wristbands. Michael stood center stage, chest heaving, drenched in sweat, voice hoarse. He raised his arms, and the crowd roared back, a communion of souls. For a moment, he felt invincible, shielded by love itself. Backstage, his knees buckled. Crew members rushed to steady him. Bill fought through the chaos. "You scared the hell out of us. But what you did out there, that was history." Michael slumped into a chair, gulping water, sweat dripping. He closed his eyes, replaying the girl's pale face, the silence, the song that rose like a prayer. He whispered, "It wasn't about me. It was about reminding them we are all human." The world would explode with headlines. But alone in his dressing room, staring into the mirror, Michael smiled faintly. He had faced fear and chaos, and turned it into something unforgettable. The dressing room felt like both sanctuary and prison. The walls were lined with flowers and cards from fans, their words of devotion spilling across colorful paper, yet the silence between them was deafening. Michael sat slumped, chest still rising and falling rapidly, every muscle in his body trembling. A damp towel clung to his neck, drops of sweat dripping onto the floor, forming dark circles that spread slowly across the carpet. His hands shook as he reached for a glass of water, but the liquid sloshed over the rim, soaking his fingers. He barely noticed. All he could hear was the echo of the crowd, their screams still vibrating inside his skull like aftershocks. Bill entered, his voice a mixture of reprimand and relief. "You shouldn't have done that, Mike. It could have been dangerous. But damn, I've never seen anything like it." Michael didn't respond. His mind was still on the girl, on her fragile hand clutching his as if it were the only lifeline she had left. He had seen fans faint before, collapse from heat or adrenaline, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the boundaries between stage and life, between performance and reality, had dissolved completely. He whispered to himself, "They need more than the music sometimes. They need to know I'm human too." A medic entered quietly, giving him a quick once-over. "Exhaustion," he murmured to Bill. "He needs fluids, rest. No interviews tonight." Michael waved them off, insisting, "I'm fine." He wasn't, not really, but he had trained himself to live beyond limits. He had danced through pain, sung through fevers, smiled through heartbreak. He could endure this too. But as he leaned back against the couch, he wondered how many more times he could keep pushing his body, his mind, before something finally broke. The hours after the concert passed in a blur. He was escorted through service corridors, shielded from the press, rushed back into the convoy of black SUVs. Fans swarmed the streets, pounding on windows, chasing the cars for blocks. Michael peered out at them, their tear-streaked faces illuminated by passing streetlights. Some held up signs that read, "Thank you, Michael." Others simply pressed their hands against the glass, desperate for a connection. He wanted to roll down the window, to tell them he saw them, felt them, but the convoy sped away into the night, leaving their cries swallowed by distance. Back at the hotel, fatigue finally crushed him. He stumbled into his suite, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without changing clothes. His jacket glittered faintly in the dim light, sequins catching the glow from the city skyline. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, flashes of stage lights, the roar of the crowd, the pale face of the girl replaying over and over. Each time he jolted awake, heart racing, only to sink back into restless slumber. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Newspapers screamed about the drama, television anchors replayed the footage on loop, fans posted shaky videos that spread like wildfire. "Michael stops show to save fans' life," one banner read. Another declared, "The king of pop's compassion stuns the world." Talk shows debated his decision, critics dissected his actions, psychologists analyzed the bond between star and audience. To the public, it was a miracle. To Michael, it was simply instinct. Still, the attention weighed on him. He sat by the window, phone buzzing constantly with calls from managers, record executives, journalists begging for statements. He ignored them all. Outside, the crowd of fans had doubled overnight, their chants echoing through the glass. He pressed his forehead against the window, whispering, "Do they love me, or do they love the idea of me?" He wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. Later that day, Bill entered with more grim news. Another letter had been found, slipped under a stagehand's door. The same handwriting, the same threats. Bill slammed it onto the table, face flushed with anger. "We can't keep letting this slide, Michael. Whoever's behind this is getting closer. We need to rethink everything." Michael stared at the words, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet conviction, he said, "No matter what they write, I'll go back out there. The stage is where I belong." Bill cursed under his breath, but knew there was no changing his mind. As the tour rolled on, the pressure only grew. Each city brought larger crowds, louder cheers, and heavier shadows. Michael's body was a battlefield of aches and bruises, his mind a maze of anxieties. Yet every night, when the lights dimmed and the music started, he transformed again. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by fire. He fed on the energy of the fans, gave back everything he had, then stumbled off stage barely able to stand. The cycle repeated, night after night, a relentless storm that threatened to consume him. One evening, in the quiet before another show, he sat alone with his notebook. The pages were filled with scribbled lyrics, fragments of thoughts, prayers disguised as poetry. He wrote about masks, about the weight of love, about the fear of being remembered only for spectacle and not for soul. His pen pressed so hard it nearly tore the paper. He paused, staring at the ink smudged on his fingers, and whispered, "Will they ever see the real me?" Despite the turmoil, he kept pushing forward. The fans needed him. The crew depended on him. The world expected nothing less than perfection. And so he gave it, night after night, even as his own reserves dwindled. He told himself the sacrifices were worth it, that the moments of unity, the fleeting connection with thousands of strangers, justified the pain. But deep down, a question gnawed at him. How long could love alone keep him standing? The city that would host his next concert buzzed with anticipation. Posters plastered every wall. Radio stations played his hits on repeat. Fans camped outside the venue days in advance. For them, it was the event of a lifetime. For Michael, it was another test, another night to prove he could rise above the shadows. He arrived at the stadium hours before showtime, slipping quietly into his dressing room. He sat before the mirror, staring at his reflection as the crew prepared around him. Makeup brushes flitted across his face, stylists fussed with his hair, assistants adjusted his costume. He barely registered their touch. His eyes were fixed on the man in the mirror, searching for strength in the stranger staring back. As showtime approached, the familiar ritual unfolded. Dancers stretched, the band tuned, security swarmed. Michael stood behind the curtain once more, heart pounding, hands trembling. The roar of the crowd seeped through the walls, louder than thunder, more powerful than any storm. He closed his eyes, drew a deep breath, and whispered again, "For them. For the music. For love." The stage manager signaled. The curtain began to rise. What followed was another night of magic. The audience erupted, Michael danced, and sang with ferocity. The energy was electric. Yet even in the midst of triumph, he couldn't escape the weight pressing on his chest. Every cheer was laced with expectation, every spotlight a reminder of his isolation. When the show ended and the confetti fell, he bowed deeply, hiding the tears streaming down his face. The crowd saw only brilliance. He felt only fragility. Back in the dressing room, silence returned. The flowers, the cards, the mirrors lined with lights, they all felt hollow. He sat alone long after the crew had left, staring at the empty chair where Bill had once scolded and comforted him. His reflection stared back, makeup smudged, eyes bloodshot, but somewhere within that brokenness flickered resilience. He knew the storm wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring new crowds, new fears, new headlines. But he also knew he couldn't stop. The music was both his curse and his salvation. And so he whispered to the silence, "Tomorrow, I'll rise again." The morning after the show dawned grey and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the city like a lid. Michael woke to the muffled hum of traffic outside his hotel, the sound blending with the faint echoes of last night's crowd still ringing in his ears. His body felt leaden, every muscle aching from the relentless performance, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion that weighed him down. It was something deeper, heavier, the kind of fatigue that seeped into his bones and made even breathing feel like effort. He sat up slowly, the sheets damp with sweat, and pressed his hands to his face. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the girl's pale face again, the chaos, the roar of the crowd silenced in that single terrifying moment. The phone rang insistently, dragging him back to reality. Bill's voice boomed on the other end. "Mike, we need to meet. There's been another letter." Michael closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. He didn't ask what it said. He already knew the threats hadn't stopped. They never would. He hung up without replying, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the fans were still there, camped on the sidewalks, holding signs, waving whenever they thought they saw movement behind the glass. Their devotion was endless, tireless, and yet Michael felt like he was drifting farther away from them with every passing day. Hours later, in the sterile conference room of the arena, Bill slammed the letter onto the table. The handwriting was jagged, furious, the words barely legible. "The stage won't save you next time." The crew shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward Michael, waiting for his reaction. He read the words calmly, then pushed the paper aside. "I'll perform," he said softly, but firmly. "Nothing changes." Bill cursed under his breath, pacing the room. "You're playing with fire, Mike. One day it's going to burn too hot." Michael didn't reply. He knew the risks. But he also knew the music was bigger than him, bigger than the threats, bigger than the fear. The days leading up to the next concert blurred together in rehearsals and security meetings. Michael buried himself in the work, perfecting routines, adjusting set lists, pushing his dancers and musicians to their limits. He demanded precision, but not out of cruelty, out of desperation. The show had to be flawless, because flaws invited doubt, and doubt invited collapse. When he wasn't rehearsing, he wrote in his notebook, filling page after page with thoughts, prayers, fragments of songs. He wrote about masks, about the loneliness of fame, about the fragile line between love and obsession. Late at night, he would read over the words until they blurred into nothing, then fall into restless sleep filled with flashes of stage lights and faceless crowds. On the morning of the concert, Michael woke before dawn. He sat by the window as the city stirred awake, watching the horizon bleed from black to grey to pale gold. He sipped tea slowly, his hands trembling just enough to spill a few drops onto the saucer. The quiet moments before the storm were always the hardest. His heart beat faster with each tick of the clock, his mind replaying every possibility, every threat, every fear. But then he thought of the fans outside, some of them waiting for days just to catch a glimpse, some of them spending their last dollar on a ticket. He thought of the girl who had collapsed, the way she had clutched his hand like a lifeline. And he knew he couldn't let them down. By the time he arrived at the stadium, the energy was already palpable. The streets were choked with fans, their chants rising into the evening air like thunder. Security struggled to contain them, police radios crackling with urgency. Inside, the crew moved with frantic precision, testing lights, adjusting microphones, marking stage positions. The dancers stretched, the band tuned, the production manager barked orders into his headset. It was chaos, but it was a familiar chaos, one that Michael had learned to thrive in. Backstage, he sat in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror as his team worked around him. The sequined jacket shimmered, the gloves gleamed, the makeup transformed his weary face into the icon the world demanded. He barely noticed their touch, his focus inward, his mind rehearsing every step, every note, every movement. He whispered to himself over and over, for them, for the music, for love. As showtime approached, the tension reached a fever pitch. Bill hovered near the door, eyes darting constantly, hand never far from his radio. The dancers huddled in a circle, their voices low, murmuring encouragements. The band stood ready, instruments gleaming under the stage lights. The crowd outside roared like a living creature, its energy vibrating through the very walls. Michael stood behind the curtain, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. The stage manager leaned close, headset crackling. "Michael, it's time." He drew a deep breath, closed his eyes, and stepped forward. The curtain rose. The explosion of sound was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of voices screamed his name, the stadium shaking with their devotion. Lights blazed, smoke billowed, the giant screens magnified his every move. He strode forward, every gesture igniting hysteria, every note tearing through the night. For the first few songs, he lost himself in the rhythm, his body moving with effortless grace, the choreography unfolding with machine-like precision. The crowd fed him energy, and he gave it back tenfold. But then, mid-set, he noticed something. Near the barricades, a disturbance rippled through the crowd. Guards surged forward, fans screamed, pushing away from the commotion. Michael's heart lurched. Not again. He slid to the edge of the stage, eyes scanning the chaos. This time, it wasn't just a fan fainting. He saw a figure struggling, a man shouting, trying to push forward against the tide of bodies. Security wrestled him back, their movements sharp and violent. Michael froze, the microphone trembling in his hand. The band played on, unaware, the dancers continued, but his focus narrowed to that one terrifying moment. The spotlight found him as he raised a hand, signaling the band to stop. The music cut off abruptly, the silence thunderous. Tens of thousands of fans held their breath. Michael crouched at the edge of the stage, his voice calm but commanding. "Peace," he said softly into the mic, "we came here for love, not hate. Let's show each other love." The words carried across the stadium, amplified by the speakers, sinking into every ear. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting his name, drowning out the chaos. The man was dragged away, but the energy had shifted. Michael stood slowly, eyes shining with tears. He raised the microphone again, his voice trembling. "No matter what happens, we are together tonight. We are one." The crowd roared, and the music resumed, louder and more powerful than before. Michael poured himself into every note, every step, his body defying exhaustion, his voice rising like a prayer. The fear melted into unity, the tension transformed into catharsis. The rest of the show blazed with passion, the stadium a sea of light and sound. By the finale, he was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, his voice hoarse. He stood center stage, arms raised, the crowd a roaring ocean before him. Confetti rained down, lights blazed, and for a moment, he felt invincible, shielded by the love of thousands. He bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face, the cheers washing over him like waves. Backstage, the exhaustion hit like a hammer. He collapsed into a chair, his body trembling, his mind replaying the chaos, the silence, the roar. Bill hovered nearby, face pale, voice tight. "You turned it around, Mike. You saved it. But it can't go on like this forever." Michael didn't respond. He knew Bill was right. But he also knew he couldn't stop. The music was his curse and his salvation, the burden he carried and the gift he gave. Alone in his dressing room, he stared into the mirror once more. His reflection was weary, eyes bloodshot, makeup smeared. But behind the fragility was fire. He whispered to himself, "As long as they believe, I'll keep going." Outside, the fans still roared, their chants echoing into the night. Michael closed his eyes, let the sound wash over him, and smiled faintly. Tomorrow would bring new fears, new threats, new exhaustion. But tonight, he had turned chaos into love. Tonight, he had reminded the world, and himself, that even in the darkest moments, the music could still heal.